In the summer of 1934, in the northwestern corner of Nebraska, a traveling photographer named Elias Vaughn arrived in the small settlement of Merriman, driving a converted wagon that served both as his home and his darkroom. He was 52 years old, a widower, and had been moving across the plains of the Midwest since 1908, following the slow rhythm of harvests and funerals, weddings and christenings, offering portraits to farming families in exchange for coins, eggs, flour, or a place to sleep beside a stove. His camera was a Kodak 2D, glass plate format, 8 by 10 inches, considered obsolete by the studios of Omaha and Chicago, but still respected in the country for the peculiar sharpness of its images. The back of his right hand was marked by old burns from silver nitrate, small pale scars that he never bothered to explain. That summer was the worst year of the Dust Bowl on record. Black storms of powdered soil moved across the plains and blocked the sun for entire days at a time. Farms had been abandoned by the hundreds. The rural population of Nebraska was falling faster than any census could measure. Methodist and Baptist churches were performing collective funerals for entire families killed by dust pneumonia, and small country cemeteries were being expanded by hand to accommodate the dead. Elias moved through this landscape offering 3 services that had become common in that decade. He photographed the elderly before winter. He photographed children whose parents feared they would not survive the year. And he photographed the dead, arranged in parlors or on kitchen tables, dressed in the best clothing the family owned. He arrived in Merriman on a morning in July. Over the following 3 days he made 6 portraits, the Kessler family standing in front of their barn, 2 brothers named Ansel and Micah Reed, both under 10, holding a wooden truck their grandfather had carved. A woman named Etta Boyle, 79 years old, seated in a chair her husband had built the year before he died, a young couple recently married, a boy of 16 holding a rifle he had inherited, and a small girl named Cora, seated on the front step of a house that no longer had glass in its windows. He was paid in eggs, in flour, in 3 silver dollars, and in 1 meal of boiled beans and cornbread. He thanked each family, packed the exposed plates into their felt-lined case, and returned to the wagon on the 3rd evening to begin the development. The darkroom inside the wagon was small and precisely arranged. A single red kerosene lantern hung above the working shelf. Trays of developer, stop bath, and fixer were set out in the same order Elias had used for more than 20 years. He lifted the first plate from its case, slid it into the developer, and watched the image begin to emerge in the dim red light. He had done this so many thousands of times that his hands moved without thought. The image that formed on the plate was not the Kessler family. It was not the barn. It was not the summer light he had captured that morning. The plate showed a closed coffin resting on 2 wooden trestles. Behind the coffin, a pastor stood with his back to the camera, one hand raised in what appeared to be a blessing. Around the coffin, arranged in a loose semicircle, stood 7 mourners in dark clothing. To the right of the coffin, slightly apart from the others, a woman in a black veil held a framed portrait against her chest, its surface angled downward so that the image inside could not be seen. The background showed a small country church that Elias did not recognize, and beyond the church a low cemetery of pale stones stretching into flat country. He stared at the plate for a long time. Then he moved it to the stop bath, then to the fixer, and set it aside. He picked up the second plate, the one that should have shown the Reed brothers, and slid it into the developer. The image that emerged was the same funeral, the same coffin, the same pastor, the same 7 mourners, the same woman with the veil and the frame. But the angle had shifted, as if the photographer had taken 1 step to the left between exposures. The pastor was now visible in partial profile. One of the mourners, a heavy man with a broad face, had turned slightly toward the camera. The third plate, which should have been Etta Boyle in her chair, showed the same funeral from behind the mourners, looking toward the pastor and the coffin. The fourth, which should have been the young couple, showed the funeral from above, as if the camera had been placed on a low branch or a roof beam. The fifth, which should have been the boy with the rifle, showed the funeral in close view, so close that the grain of the wood of the coffin was visible, along with a black ribbon tied around one of its handles. The sixth, which should have been the girl Cora on her step, showed the woman in the veil in 3/4 profile, still holding the frame downward. her hands pale against the black fabric of her dress. Elias sat in the wagon for several hours without moving. He drank water from a tin cup. He lit a second lantern. He examined each plate under a small brass magnifier and confirmed that the images were real silver emulsion, not double exposures, not marks in the glass, not chemical accidents. He turned the plates over and inspected the labels he had written himself in pencil 3 days earlier. The labels matched what he had photographed. The images did not. Before dawn, he opened a new case of unused plates, one he had purchased in Omaha several months earlier and had not yet touched. He loaded a fresh plate into the camera, walked out into the dark yard behind the wagon, and photographed the empty field. He returned to the wagon and developed the plate under the red lantern. The image that appeared was another angle of the same funeral, this one showing the pastor from the side, his mouth open as if in the middle of a spoken word. Elias reloaded and photographed the interior wall of the wagon. The plate revealed another angle. He photographed the wooden floor beside his boots. The plate revealed another angle. By the 7th plate, he had stopped naming what he was doing. He simply loaded, exposed, and developed, filling the shelf beside him with images of a funeral he had never attended, taken by a hand that was not his, showing people he did not know in a place he could not locate. On the 8th plate, the framed portrait held by the woman in the veil had begun to tilt upward, as if she was slowly, over the course of many exposures, raising it toward the camera. The following morning he harnessed his horse and drove east toward the town of Valentine, the largest settlement in that part of Nebraska. He carried the plates wrapped in black cloth in a wooden crate beneath the driver's bench. He did not speak to anyone on the road. In Valentine, he asked at the general store for the name of a Methodist pastor who had served in the county for more than 20 years. He was directed to a man named Reverend Halloway, whose face he had seen in profile in 3 of the plates. Halloway received him in the parsonage kitchen. He was a thin man in his 60s, with pale eyes and a slow manner of speech. Elias placed the plates on the table one by one and asked him to look. Halloway looked for a long time. He confirmed that he was the man in the plates. He confirmed that the church behind the mourners was not his church, and that he did not recognize the cemetery, and that he had never officiated the funeral shown in the images. He said that he had never seen the coffin. He said that he did not recognize any of the 7 mourners. Then he lifted the plate that showed the veiled woman in 3/4 profile, and he held it up to the window, and he sat very still. He told Elias that the woman in the veil had appeared in his sleep every night for the past week. He said that she stood at the foot of his bed, holding the framed portrait downward, and that she never spoke, and that when he tried to see the image in the frame, she turned the frame further away. He said that he had told no one about it, because he was afraid it meant he was dying. He asked Elias to leave the plates with him overnight. Elias refused, wrapped them again in the black cloth, and left before sundown. He drove west without a plan. He stopped in Ainsworth, then in Cody, then in a nameless crossing near the Snake River. He continued to photograph and develop. Each new plate revealed another angle of the funeral, moving slowly, as if the invisible photographer were circling the coffin one small step at a time. On the 9th plate, the frame in the veiled woman's hands had risen to the level of her waist. On the 10th, it had risen to her chest. On the 11th, it had risen to her chin. Elias stopped eating regularly. He slept in short intervals in the driver's bench, upright, with the reins wrapped around his wrist. On the night of September 18th, camped on a low rise 3 miles north of Merriman, he developed the 12th plate. The night was cloudless and without a moon. The red lantern seemed weaker than usual, and the wind outside the wagon carried the fine sound of powdered soil moving against the wooden walls. The image emerged slowly, the way images always emerged, first the darkest shapes, then the middle tones, then the fine detail. This time the angle was frontal. The pastor stood behind the coffin, facing the camera. The 7 mourners stood in a wider semicircle so that all of their faces were visible. The woman in the black veil stood at the front, and she had raised the framed portrait fully, holding it up toward the camera at the level of her own face. For the first time, the image inside the frame was clearly visible. It was a portrait of a man of about 50 years, seated against a plain backdrop, wearing a dark coat, his right hand resting on his knee. The pale scars on the back of that hand were visible even in the small scale of the image within the image. The man in the frame was Elias Vaughan. The portrait had been made on an 8x10 glass plate, in the same format, in the same style, with the same lens characteristics as every portrait Elias had made since 1908. In the lower corner of the frame, written by hand in black ink, was a date. It read, September 19th, 1934. Elias placed the plate on the shelf, extinguished the lantern, and sat in the dark. He did not develop a 13th plate that night. He did not attempt any further exposures. According to the account later reconstructed from his own written notes, found folded inside a Bible in the driver's box, he spent the following morning writing letters that he did not send. He wrote to his late wife. He wrote to a brother in Iowa who had not spoken to him in 20 years. He wrote to no one in particular, describing the plates in careful language, using the vocabulary of chemistry and optics, avoiding any word that might sound uncertain. The letters were dated September 19th, 1934. On the morning of September 20th, a farmer named Odell Briggs, driving cattle north of Merriman, saw the wagon standing motionless in the middle of a field of dry grass. The horse was still harnessed and had begun to eat the sparse growth around the wheels. Briggs approached and called out. No one answered. He climbed onto the driver's bench and looked through the small door into the darkroom. He later told the county sheriff that the interior was orderly, that the trays of chemicals had been emptied and set aside, and that a man of about 50 years lay on the narrow cot at the back of the wagon, fully dressed, his hands folded on his chest. The man had no identification on his person. There was no wound, no sign of struggle, no bottle of laudanum or spirits within reach. Beside the cot, on the working shelf, 12 developed glass plates had been stacked in careful order and wrapped in black cloth. A 13th plate remained inside the camera, still virgin, still unexposed. The sheriff took possession of the wagon and its contents. The plates were held at the county office for 3 weeks, while notices were placed in newspapers as far as Lincoln and Omaha, asking for anyone who might recognize the deceased. No family came forward. The body was buried in a shallow grave at the edge of the Merriman Municipal Cemetery, without a headstone and without a farewell portrait, on October 11th, 1934. The parish records of the small Methodist church in Merriman confirm this burial. They also record something that has troubled local historians ever since. In the church register, on the page listing burials for the autumn of 1934, the name of the deceased was left blank. But in the margin, in handwriting that does not match that of the pastor of Merriman or of any known clerk of the county, someone wrote a single line. It reads, in ink now faded to the color of rust, the words portrait held aloft September 19th, funeral witnessed from 12 angles, no 13th image made. The 12 plates were kept in the county office until 1946, when a fire destroyed most of the records of that decade. What remained was moved to a state archive in Lincoln, where the crate labeled Vaughan was catalogued and shelved without further examination. When researchers opened the crate in the summer of 1978, they found the black cloth intact, the wooden lining intact, and the crate empty. There is no record of any transfer, any loan, or any inventory adjustment between 1946 and 1978. The plates are not listed as lost because they were never officially declared missing. They are simply absent. Reverend Halloway died in 1941 of natural causes. His personal papers, donated to a small library in Valentine, include a sealed envelope that his family requested to remain unopened. The envelope is marked with a single word in his handwriting. It reads in the same slow, careful script that filled his sermons for 40 years, the word Merriman. The envelope has not been opened. The library keeps it in a locked drawer, in a room that is not open to the public, on a shelf beside other envelopes marked with the names of towns where funerals were never held. The wagon was eventually broken apart for its lumber. The horse was sold at auction. The camera, an 8x10 Kodak 2D of a model long out of production, was purchased by an unknown buyer at the estate sale and has not been documented since. No photograph of Elias Vaughan is known to exist in any public or private collection. He appears in no census record after 1920. He appears in no obituary. The only image that ever captured his face, according to what the county sheriff wrote in his final report before closing the case, was the small framed portrait held aloft by a woman in a black veil. In the 12th plate of a series that was completed on the night of September 18, 1934, and never fully explained.